There are not many things that can generate the energy needed to create a temporal displacement. Unfortunately, it requires something with a little more kick. Plutonium.
Safe now. Everything's lead lined.
I did it. It was very challenging, but I did it. Especially because I wanted to make it act like when Doc loads it into the reactor of the DeLorean. So he places it in and then rotates and then it releases the plutonium. So I wanted to make it act like this. But all the props that I've seen online, they were a solid base. You could not release the plutonium. So I had to do a lot of brainstorming to figure out how to make this work and still look clear inside. And I'm really happy. There were things that I would do differently, but overall, I'm really happy with it. And I am already planning to do a second attempt of this build, especially because well, now that I know what I could have done differently, I know exactly what were my mistakes and I can do better for sure. But if you want to see how I made this one, keep watching.
Plutonium using to put inside of this canister is from the Dr. Collector Travel Memories Plutonium Edition collector box, and I will make everything based on that. It's pretty screen accurate, so that's good. And I'm using this like clear tube. It's a guard for fluorescent bulbs. So I'm gonna use that because that's actually the perfect dimension to put around the plutonium. I just cut it with an X-Acto knife to the correct height. And I got this hourglass from the dollar store, and it's the perfect material. It's like an acrylic slash plexiglass. And I cleaned it with just a glass cleaner, but it's the perfect size. It's 7 centimeters diameter, and I'm using this plastic to make later on I'm going to use it as the top, but it's just the clear plastic I had at home. And a few options for this would be a CD cover or any clear plastic you may have at home. I tried cutting it with an X-Acto knife, but it was very brittle, ended up breaking. So I'm using this hot knife. It's pretty much an X-Acto knife, but you just plug it and it gets really hot. So I'm essentially melting the plastic, and that way you won't break. So I just use a hot knife to cut a circle. That's the exact dimension of the exact diameter of my tube, and fits perfectly. That's great. That's how I started. I ended up choosing to use a thicker plexiglass, like an acrylic sheet I had at home, because this was a lot thicker and less brittle. So same idea, I just traced the tube on it, and then cut using a hot knife. And I had to sand the edges because they were all melted, so I had to sand to smooth it down. And I also used my hottery tool to make it easier. Just sanding really quick. And I'm peeling the protective layer because yes, this is all clear acrylic. That's very important, and there's a reason why I chose to use the plexiglass at the bottom. It's because it's thicker. So I did 2 of those circles, 2 of those discs, and there they are aligned, exact same dimensions. I'm just seeing, that's me brainstorming how I'm gonna do the bottom mechanism of the canister. So essentially they're going to be two discs. They're going to rotate on top of each other. And to make the like the axis, what's going to unite the two discs, it's going to be this push pin, like, you know, the pins you use on cork boards. So I needed something that would be clear, and that's what I had in hand. is essentially what I was looking for was a clear nail, but they don't exist. So I'm just using the push pin, and it turned out pretty good. Although I was pretty tight, the 7 centimeter diameter was just enough. Now I am drilling around the hole that I drilled in the middle. I needed to make room for that push pin head to sit flat on that plexiglass. So that's the idea, and there's a close-up video. And then I made the other circle inside. That's where the inner tube is gonna go. So that's essentially what it's gonna be. Two discs exactly the same, and they're gonna be held together by the push pin. And it's gonna sit right in the middle, and the two discs are going to glide on top of each other. And when they both align, then the plutonium is gonna fall through. As you can see, I barely had room, so I would advise to use a little bigger, like at least 3 inches of a tube. Next step was to glue the inner tube on the top disc, and I used a UV resin for this. So UV resin, I needed something that would be clear, and surprisingly, glue for acrylic is not very easy to find. So I ended up using UV resin, worked out great. So the idea here is to make that bottom completely leak proof. So I'm gonna fill it with a liquid, and I needed to make sure that liquid was not gonna leak. So UV resin was a good alternative because it dries, like it cures instantly after the light. So I could build layers on top of layers and make a good leak-proof seal. That's the result, and looks very clean. And now just double checking that I would have room, I put the disc. So again, the other disc also had that, I also carved it where the push pin was gonna go. And again, just demonstrating, making sure, actually I'm just making sure it was gonna work. So just put that pin in there. It's sitting flat, it's sitting nice, it's countersunk. And then put the top one in there, and again, that's how it's gonna go. The plutonium is gonna go in that tube, and when they align, it's gonna go through. Just my pin was a little too tall, and I had to trim it. Again, using the hot knife to trim it down a little bit. And actually what was gonna hold it in place, so that pin was gonna be glued to the top disc, and the head was gonna be holding what's gonna hold the bottom disc. So there we go, the bottom disc, and now the top one. I just need now to glue. So I used again UV resin to glue the pin on the top disc. Made a little layer in there, cured, to make sure I wouldn't glue all the two discs together. So tried it out, still gliding, awesome. Now on to building a lot more UV resin in there, and make sure that pin was not gonna get loose, so it was gonna be held very well in there. Still very nice, and at that point I was so happy because I almost gave up, but at that point it was working amazingly. Now there's not many options. I had to glue my tube around, and the glue I used for this, I decided to try something else rather than the UV resin. I'm using this glue that's called Lepage or Lepage, I'm not sure. It's a super glue specific for plastic, and it comes in two parts. The first part is the activator, and you're supposed to put that on both sides of the plastics you want to glue. So my base and my tube, and then you wait 60 seconds and use the step number 2, that's the plastic super glue. So you just put that on one of the sides and place it on. It worked pretty good. Once I put it down, that was it. It was stuck in there, although I could not trust that it would be leak proof. So that's why I built a very generous layer of my UV resin at the bottom. Essentially I just put a lot in there and spread it out with a skewer. That's it. So I just spread it out with a skewer. The idea is to build a thick layer that seals around the border of the outer tube and the inner tube. And again, UV light, and I repeat this a few times to make sure. Again, the most important part of all this work is to make it leak proof. So I wanted to make sure that it would be leak proof. I also put a layer on the outside of the tube, between the tube and the disc, and still working. The discs are still rotating. My plutonium is good in there, and I'm trying out to see if it's gonna fall through, and that's my very first attempt. And here's the big moment. I was very nervous, and it worked. Oh, the relief. It worked. Now the next step was to make my lid, and I used a thinner plastic for that because it wouldn't really be affected as much by the pressure of the liquid. So just tracing it out where the inner circle would go, and again my hot knife to cut my plastic. And really easy because this one's a lot thinner, and I also sanded like to smooth it in the edges. I just didn't film that. And I filled the canister with baby oil. I had a few options. Water was not an option because I just assumed it would get cloudy over time. I've had an aquarium and that's what usually happened. Just algae would grow inside or something. And my other options would be mineral oil or glycerin. I couldn't find mineral oil in my city, and glycerin was a little thick, like too thick. So baby oil it was, and I think it was a very good idea. It acts like water, doesn't get any bubbles, and I don't think anything's gonna grow in it. For the lid, I used a generous amount of UV resin in there. I didn't have I wouldn't have many chances to fix the lid if I screwed it up. So I just put a generous amount all the lid, like on all the lid, place it in, use my UV light to cure it, and then more and more UV resin. I had to build a thick layer around the inner tube and around the outer tube. And the only way to put resin inside the tube was if I put it on the lid, so I just used a lot. And now next step, I used a little bit of tape. I didn't want it to be very messy, so I'm just using a tape to almost make a straight line in there. Didn't work as well as I was planning, but worked okay. Again, UV light, and that is it.
But yeah, if you like this type of content, if you like prop building, if you like geeky DIYs, subscribe to this channel. This is what I like to do. This is my hobby. It's my passion. And I'll see you later.